December 19, 1945. The war had been over for 4 months, but for the 43 Japanese women standing on the fog-shrouded dock in San Francisco, their ordeal was far from finished. They had spent the previous 6 weeks in the hold of a military transport ship, crossing the Pacific from the Philippines, where they had been captured during the final chaotic days of the war. Each woman wore the same expression, a mask of rigid dignity barely concealing the terror that churned beneath. They were members of the Imperial Japanese Women's Auxiliary Corps, trained to serve the empire with unwavering loyalty. Now they stood on enemy soil, waiting for a fate they believed would be brutal and swift. Keiko Yamamoto stood at the front of the group, her 24 years weighing heavily on shoulders that had once carried the confidence of a skilled communications officer. She had joined the Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing she was serving her homeland's sacred mission. The daughter of a school teacher in Osaka, she had been educated, capable, and proud. Now, standing in the cold morning air of an American port, she felt only the hollowness of defeat and the certainty of coming punishment. The other women looked to her for strength, and she forced herself to stand straighter, even as her legs trembled beneath her worn uniform. American soldiers surrounded them, rifles held ready but not aimed. Keiko had expected shouting, violence, the savage treatment that Japanese propaganda had promised would come from these Western barbarians. Instead, the soldiers maintained a professional distance, their faces unreadable. One of them, a tall officer with graying hair at his temples, stepped forward and addressed them through an interpreter. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as he explained they would be transported to a facility in Northern California, where they would be held until repatriation procedures could be completed. Repatriation. The word hung in the air like a question none of them wanted to answer. What were they returning to? What Japan still existed after the firestorms and the terrible new bombs that had ended the war? The trucks that arrived to transport them were clean, far cleaner than Keiko had expected. As the women climbed aboard, she caught a glimpse of the city beyond the port, buildings rising against the gray sky, intact and functioning. There had been no battle here, no destruction like what she knew waited for them in Japan. The contrast struck her with unexpected force. These Americans lived in a world that the war had barely touched, while her homeland lay in ruins. The journey inland took several hours, the landscape rolling past in shades of green that seemed impossibly lush after years of war-torn islands and military installations. None of the women spoke. They had agreed before landing that they would maintain dignity and silence, giving their captors no satisfaction, no weakness to exploit. When the trucks finally stopped, Keiko saw a compound of simple wooden buildings surrounded by wire fencing. Guard towers stood at the corners, but something about the facility seemed less harsh than she had anticipated. As they were led from the trucks, a Japanese-American soldier stepped forward, his face carefully neutral, as he spoke to them in their own language. His accent was strange, American-influenced, but the familiar sounds of Japanese brought unexpected tears to several women's eyes. He introduced himself as Private David Kim and explained the basic rules of the camp. His presence confused Keiko, a Japanese man in an American uniform, guarding Japanese prisoners. What did that mean about the nature of their captivity? The first night in the compound passed without sleep for most of the women. They lay on narrow cots in a long barracks, listening to unfamiliar sounds and imagining worse horrors to come. Keiko stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying every piece of propaganda she had absorbed during her years of service. Americans were cruel, savage, without honor. They would torture prisoners for sport, violate women without mercy, execute captives without trial. Yet the building was heated against the December cold. The blankets, though thin, were clean. No one had struck them or even raised their voice. Morning brought their first full day under American authority. The women rose at dawn, instinctively maintaining military discipline even in captivity. They stood in formation in the central yard, waiting for orders that came through Private Kim's translation. Captain Robert Mitchell, the facility commander, Address them with words that seemed carefully chosen to avoid provocation. They would be assigned work duties, he explained, light tasks to maintain the compound. They would receive 3 meals daily. They would be permitted to write letters through the International Red Cross to locate family members. Medical care would be provided. Keiko translated quietly for those whose English was weaker, but she struggled to reconcile the captain's words with everything she had been taught. This was not how enemies treated prisoners. This was not the barbarism they had been promised. Around her, the other women maintained expressions of careful neutrality, but she could see the same confusion reflected in their eyes. Hanasato, barely 20 years old and looking younger, stood with her arms wrapped around herself, despite the heavy coat she had been issued. The girl had been a typist, assigned to headquarters in Manila when the Americans advanced. Now she seemed perpetually on the verge of tears, uncertain whether to feel relief or terror at their treatment. The dining hall presented their first true test. Long tables had been set with metal trays and cups. The women filed in silently, taking seats in a tight group at one end, instinctively maintaining distance from their captors. What appeared before them was simple fare: white rice, steamed vegetables, and miso soup that tasted nothing like home, but was recognizably Japanese in inspiration. Someone in the American kitchen had attempted to provide familiar food. The gesture unsettled Keiko more than cruelty would have. She could understand cruelty, prepare for it, steel herself against it. But kindness? What was she supposed to do with that? Sergeant Maria Gonzalez supervised the meal, her dark eyes watching the Japanese women with an expression that seemed more curious than hostile. She was perhaps 30, stocky and competent, and she moved through the dining hall with easy authority. When one of the younger prisoners accidentally knocked over her cup, spilling water across the table, the girl froze in terror, waiting for punishment. Sergeant Gonzalez simply brought a cloth and wiped up the spill without comment. The small moment rippled through the group like a stone dropped in still water. January brought rain that turned the compound into a landscape of mud and gray skies. The women had settled into a routine of work and silence, performing their assigned duties with mechanical efficiency while maintaining careful distance from their American captors. They cleaned barracks, assisted in the laundry, and helped prepare vegetables in the kitchen. Each task was completed with the precision of their military training, but without engagement or connection. They were bodies moving through space, waiting for whatever came next. Private David Kim watched them with feelings he could not fully articulate. His own family had spent 3 years behind barbed wire at Manzanar internment camp while he fought for a country that had imprisoned his parents and younger sister. He had joined the military to prove his loyalty, to demonstrate that Japanese Americans were not the enemy. Now he stood guard over actual enemy prisoners, women who had served the empire that attacked Pearl Harbor, and he found himself unable to hate them. They looked exhausted, frightened, and desperately homesick. They looked like his sister might have looked if circumstances had been reversed. One afternoon he noticed Hanasato shivering as she hung laundry in the cold drizzle. She wore only the thin jacket that had been part of her original uniform, inadequate against the Northern California winter. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and her hands shook as she fumbled with clothespins. Kim knew the supply room had extra jackets, heavier ones meant for outdoor work details. He retrieved one without asking permission and approached her carefully, knowing sudden movements might trigger panic. He held out the jacket, speaking in Japanese. For warmth, he said simply. Hana stared at him as if he had offered her something dangerous. Her eyes darted to the other women working nearby, seeking guidance. Keiko had noticed the exchange and watched with careful attention. The jacket was clearly American military issue, thick wool in olive drab. Accepting it felt like accepting something more than warmth, like acknowledging a debt or admitting vulnerability. But Hana was shaking badly now, and pride seemed a foolish reason to refuse practical necessity. She took the jacket with a small bow, her training in courtesy overriding her uncertainty. "Arigato gozaimasu," she whispered. Kim nodded and walked away, but the moment had been witnessed by everyone in the yard. That evening, as the women gathered in their barracks, the jacket became a subject of intense, quiet discussion. Why would an American soldier, especially one of Japanese ancestry, show kindness to enemy prisoners? What did he want? What did it mean? Keiko had no answers, but she found herself remembering the expression on Kim's face when he had offered the jacket. It had not been calculation or strategy. It had looked impossibly like simple human compassion. That night, she wrote in her diary, a small notebook she had managed to keep through capture and transport. Today, an enemy showed kindness where none was required. I do not know what to do with this information. February arrived with news that rippled through the camp like an electric current. Captain Mitchell had called a general assembly, something that happened rarely and always meant significant changes. The Japanese women gathered in the main hall, standing in neat rows as they had been trained, their faces carefully composed. Keiko positioned herself at the front, where she could hear clearly and translate if needed. Around her, she could feel the tension radiating from the other women. Announcements meant decisions about their fate, and none of them knew whether to hope or fear what might come next. Captain Mitchell entered with Sergeant Gonzalez and Private Kim, his expression unreadable. He waited until the room fell completely silent before speaking, his voice carrying across the assembled prisoners. "Ladies," he began, and Keiko noticed he used that word rather than prisoners. A supply shipment arrived yesterday from the quartermaster depot. Among the provisions were items we have not seen in quantity since before the war ended. Fresh meat, including beef. The word beef hung in the air. Several women exchanged glances of confusion. Why was the captain telling them about American food supplies? Mitchell continued, and now his voice carried something that sounded almost like warmth. Corporal Patterson, our head cook, has proposed that we prepare a proper meal for everyone in this facility, guards and prisoners alike. He wants to make beef stew with potatoes, carrots, onions, and fresh bread. He believes that after the hardships of war, everyone deserves a decent meal. Keiko felt her breath catch. She must have misunderstood. She must have missed something in the translation. Beef for prisoners? Hana turned to look at her with wide eyes, silently asking if she had heard correctly. Around the room, the other women stood frozen in disbelief. They had not tasted meat since 1944, since before the American advance had cut off supply lines and reduced their rations to rice and whatever vegetables could be scrounged. The idea of beef, of rich stew, of abundance rather than mere subsistence, seemed like something from another lifetime. Captain Mitchell seemed to understand their confusion. "I know this may seem unusual," he said through Kim's translation, "but in America, we believe that all people deserve to be treated with basic dignity. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also human beings far from home, and you will be treated as such while under our care. The meal will be served tomorrow evening. That is all." As they filed out of the hall, the women moved in stunned silence. Keiko heard fragments of whispered conversation in Japanese around her. Is this real? Why would they do this? What do they want from us? But beneath the questions ran a current of something else, something none of them wanted to acknowledge. Hope mixed with confusion, hunger mixed with suspicion, and underneath it all, the dangerous possibility that everything they had been taught about their enemies might have been wrong. The following day moved with agonizing slowness. The women completed their work assignments with distracted efficiency, their minds focused on the evening ahead. None of them spoke openly about the promised meal, as if acknowledging it might make it disappear like a mirage. But Keiko noticed how their eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen building, where Corporal Patterson and his staff had been working since dawn. The smell began drifting across the compound around mid-afternoon, rich and meaty and impossibly complex after years of bland subsistence rations. Hana clutched Keiko's arm as they walked toward the dining hall that evening. "I can smell it," she whispered in Japanese. "Is it real? Can you smell it?" Keiko nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The aroma triggered memories she had tried to suppress, of her mother's kitchen in Osaka before the war, of family dinners when meat was still available, of a life that seemed impossibly distant now. Around them, the other women moved like sleepwalkers, drawn forward by scent and disbelief. The dining hall had been transformed. The usual stark functionality had been softened with attempts at decoration. Someone had placed small vases with winter branches on each table. The harsh overhead lights had been dimmed slightly. American guards and staff were already seated at some tables, their own bowls waiting to be filled. The Japanese women took their usual seats together, 43 women pressed close as if proximity could provide protection against whatever this moment might mean. Then Corporal Patterson emerged from the kitchen with the first serving pot. He was a broad man in his 40s, with the careful hands of someone who had cooked professionally before the war. Behind him came other kitchen staff carrying more pots, and the smell intensified until it filled every corner of the room. Patterson began ladling stew into bowls, thick portions with visible chunks of beef, potatoes golden with butter, carrots that had been cooked until tender, all swimming in rich brown gravy that steamed in the cool air. When the first bowl was placed before Keiko, she found herself unable to move. The stew looked like something from memory, from before everything changed. Tender beef that would melt on the tongue, vegetables cooked with care rather than merely boiled into submission, gravy that spoke of abundance rather than rationing. Around her, bowls were being placed before the other women, and the silence in their section of the hall became absolute. 43 women stared at their meals as if confronting something beyond comprehension. Hana's hands trembled as she lifted her spoon. Tears ran down her face unchecked, and she was not alone. Several women wept openly, their careful composure shattered by this unexpected kindness. Others sat frozen, struggling to reconcile this abundance with the narrative of American cruelty they had carried like armor. This was food worthy of honored guests. This was food that represented care and consideration. This was food that said, "You matter, you are human, you deserve dignity." Keiko finally tasted the stew, and the flavors overwhelmed her. The days following the beef stew dinner brought subtle but unmistakable changes to the compound. The invisible wall between guards and prisoners, maintained through months of careful distance, began to develop cracks. It started with eye contact that lasted a fraction longer, with nods of acknowledgement that carried more weight than simple routine. The Japanese women still moved through their work assignments with precision, but now there was a quality of engagement rather than mechanical compliance. Something had shifted in that dining hall, and neither group could pretend otherwise. Private Kim found himself at the center of this gradual transformation. His ability to speak Japanese, however American accented, made him the natural bridge between two worlds. Women who had previously avoided all interaction now approached him with questions about English words they had overheard, about American customs that confused them, about the vast mystery of what their captors actually believed. He answered carefully, aware that every word carried weight beyond its immediate meaning. His own complicated feelings about this assignment, about guarding women who served the empire while his family languished in an internment camp, had begun to evolve into something he had not expected: understanding. Sergeant Gonzalez noticed how Hana had begun to linger after meals, carefully observing how the kitchen staff cleaned and organized their workspace. The girl had talent, Gonzalez thought, watching how Hana's eyes tracked the efficient movements, how she noticed small improvements that could be made. One afternoon, Gonzalez approached her with a simple question in broken Japanese she had learned from Kim. "You help kitchen?" Hana looked startled, then uncertain, then finally nodded. The assignment was unofficial, outside the normal work rotations, but it gave Hana something she had not experienced in years: purpose beyond mere survival. Keiko's English had improved dramatically through constant exposure, and her natural aptitude for languages. She found herself translating not just words but concepts, helping other women understand American idioms and cultural references that made no sense through direct translation. Captain Mitchell noticed her abilities and began requesting her assistance with administrative tasks, having her help process the Red Cross correspondence that was finally beginning to bring news from Japan. The news was rarely good. Most letters reported destruction, displacement, families scattered across the ruined islands, but knowing was better than the agonizing uncertainty they had endured. The breakthrough came during an evening in late February when several guards brought a radio into the common area. They had permission to play music for an hour, and someone suggested that the Japanese women might want to listen as well. What followed was an impromptu cultural exchange. American popular music filled the barracks, strange rhythms and lyrics the women could not understand, but found themselves swaying to nonetheless. Then Kim, encouraged by the others, asked if the Japanese women knew any songs they might share. After whispered consultation, Keiko stood and began to sing a traditional folk song from her childhood, a simple melody about cherry blossoms and the passing of seasons. Her voice was clear and slightly trembling, but the other women joined in one by one until all 43 voices blended in harmony. March brought spring rains and something far more devastating than weather. The Tokyo war crimes trials had begun, and American newspapers arrived at the camp with increasing frequency. Captain Mitchell had established a small library where prisoners could read, believing that information was better than ignorance, even when that information carried unbearable weight. The first stories about Japanese conduct during the war appeared in stark black and white photographs and clinical descriptions that made the horrors somehow worse through their detached language. Keiko sat at a wooden table in the library, newspapers spread before her like evidence at a trial. The Bataan Death March. The systematic starvation of Allied prisoners, medical experiments conducted on living subjects, the brutal treatment of civilians in occupied territories. Each article struck her like a physical blow, dismantling piece by piece the narrative she had built her adult life around. She had believed she was serving a noble cause, defending her homeland against Western aggression. Now these pages told a different story, one where Japan was not the victim, but the perpetrator of systematic cruelty. Her hands trembled. As she read testimony from American prisoners who had survived Japanese camps, they described conditions that made her current captivity seem like luxury. Starvation rations of a few grains of rice, beatings for minor infractions, men worked to death building railways through jungle. The contrast between what Japan had done to its prisoners and what America was doing to her became a weight she could barely carry. She thought of the beef stew, of Private Kim's jacket for Hana, of Captain Mitchell's careful courtesy, and felt shame burn through her chest like acid. Hana found her there as afternoon faded into evening, tears streaming down Keiko's face and dripping onto the newspaper photographs. Hana sat beside her without speaking, pulling one of the papers closer to read. Her face went pale as she absorbed the words, her lips moving silently as she translated the English in her mind. Other women began to gather, drawn by some instinct that something significant was happening. They read over shoulders, passed papers between them with shaking hands, confronted the documented evidence of atrocities committed in the name of the empire they had served. Yuki Tanaka, who had been a nurse and had seen combat casualties, spoke first in a voice barely above a whisper. "I knew soldiers could be cruel. War makes men into beasts sometimes, but this is not the cruelty of battle. This is organized. This is policy." Michiko Nakamura, older at 32 and a former administrative officer, sat heavily in a chair as if her legs would no longer support her. "We did this? Our military, our government, our people did these things?" The question hung unanswered because the evidence was irrefutable. These were not Allied propaganda lies, though many wanted desperately to believe they were. The photographs were too detailed, the testimonies too consistent, the documentation too thorough. Private Kim entered the library to find the women sitting in devastated silence, and he understood immediately what they had discovered. He had seen this same expression on other Japanese prisoners when confronted with the truth of their nation's conduct. That night, Keiko wrote in her diary with a hand that could barely hold the pen, "We thought we were the civilized ones. We thought Americans were barbarians. How could we have been so completely, so catastrophically wrong?" Summer arrived with official correspondence from the War Department. Repatriation procedures were being finalized for Japanese prisoners throughout the American camp system. The women at the Northern California facility would be processed for return to Japan within 6 weeks. Captain Mitchell delivered the news during a morning assembly, his voice carrying the weight of someone announcing something he was not entirely comfortable with. The women received the information in silence, their faces revealing nothing, but Keiko felt her stomach twist with emotions she could not untangle. Return to Japan, the words should have brought relief, even joy, home, family, freedom from captivity. But what did those concepts mean anymore? Letters from the Red Cross had painted a devastating picture of post-war Japan. Cities reduced to ash and rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions homeless and starving. The economy collapsed, families scattered across the islands, searching for each other through makeshift communication networks. Of the 43 women in the compound, only 12 had received any news of their families. 3 had learned their parents and siblings were dead, killed in the firebombing of Tokyo. The others lived in agonizing uncertainty. That evening, Keiko called an informal meeting in the barracks. The women gathered on their cots, sitting in a circle, as they had not done since their first terrified nights in captivity. Now the fear was different, more complex. "What are we returning to?" Keiko asked quietly in Japanese. "What Japan still exists?" Hana spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been months ago. "My family was in Yokohama. I have heard nothing. If they survived, they are homeless. If I return, I will be one more mouth to feed in a country that has no food." Michiko, who had worked in military administration and understood bureaucracy, raised another concern. "We will return as failed soldiers, as women who were captured, who surrendered rather than choosing death. We will carry shame not just for our capture, but for what we have learned here. How can we return to a society that may not want to hear the truth about what our military did?" The question opened a floodgate of anxieties they had been suppressing. They had spent 8 months in American captivity, being treated with dignity and care. They had been fed, housed, given medical attention, and shown respect. They had formed tentative friendships with their captors. They had learned that everything their propaganda had taught them was a lie. More troubling still, they had discovered talents and possibilities they never knew existed. Hana had become skilled in the kitchen, learning American cooking techniques that fascinated her. Keiko had found she had a gift for translation and cultural mediation. Yuki had been working with the camp medical officer, expanding her nursing knowledge. Reiko Watanabe had demonstrated unexpected mechanical aptitude, helping repair equipment. They had become useful, valued, even respected in small ways that would mean nothing in a devastated Japan struggling simply to survive. The most dangerous thought, the one none of them wanted to speak aloud, surfaced finally from Yuki. What if we did not return immediately? What if there was another option? The words hung in the humid summer air like a confession of treason, and yet no one rushed to contradict her. The decision took 3 weeks of agonized debate, conducted in whispered Japanese during work breaks and late-night discussions in the barracks. Keiko found herself at the center of conversations that felt like walking through a minefield of conflicting loyalties. To ask to stay with their former enemies felt like betrayal of everything they had been raised to believe. Yet to return to certain hardship when an alternative might exist felt like abandoning their own survival for the sake of abstract honor. The women were deeply divided, not just between each other, but within themselves. Finally, on a humid morning in late July, Keiko requested a private meeting with Captain Mitchell. She had rehearsed her words in English until they were perfect, but when she stood in his office, her carefully prepared speech dissolved into halting phrases that barely captured what she needed to say. Captain Mitchell listened without interruption, his expression grave, as she explained that some of the women had been discussing their futures and had reached a conclusion that might seem unusual or even inappropriate. 18 of us, Keiko said, her accent thick with emotion despite months of practice, have been writing letters through Red Cross. Most have no family left or no news. Japan is destroyed. We would return to nothing. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. We have learned much here. About America, about ourselves, about what happened during war that we did not know. She met his eyes directly, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 8 months ago. We wish to ask if there is possibility to remain in America rather than immediate repatriation. The silence that followed felt endless. Captain Mitchell leaned back in his chair, processing what he had just heard. Japanese women prisoners requesting to stay with their captors rather than accept freedom to return home. The implications were staggering. It would require navigating military bureaucracy, immigration law, and public opinion that might not understand why enemy nationals deserved such consideration. But Mitchell had watched these women transform over the months. He had seen genuine remorse, real growth, and authentic desire to build different lives than the ones their war-torn country could offer. Private Kim was called in to ensure accurate translation for what followed. Mitchell explained that such a request was unprecedented, but not necessarily impossible. The women would need to be reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons. They would need American sponsors willing to provide housing and employment. They would face suspicion and prejudice from communities still raw from war. They would be giving up any claim to Japanese government support or recognition. It would be, he emphasized carefully, far more difficult than simply returning to Japan despite the hardships there. Keiko listened to each obstacle and felt her resolve strengthen rather than weaken. Difficult is not the same as impossible, she replied. We are not asking for easy path. We are asking for chance to build lives that honor what we have learned here, that make amends for what our country did, that allow us to become better than we were. Mitchell studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Let me contact my superiors. I cannot promise anything, but I will present your request. 5 years had passed since that extraordinary summer when 18 Japanese women made their unprecedented request. The response from Washington had been cautiously favorable, influenced by emerging Cold War politics that made demonstrating American generosity toward former enemies strategically valuable. The women were reclassified as displaced persons and released into a sponsorship program that connected them with families and organizations willing to help them transition to American life. The process had been neither simple nor painless, but it had been possible. Keiko Yamamoto stood in her small restaurant in San Francisco's Japantown, a neighborhood slowly rebuilding after the war and the internment years. The evening rush had ended, and she was alone with her thoughts and her memories. On the wall behind the counter hung a photograph that she looked at every day. 43 women seated at long tables, bowls of beef stew before them, their faces showing shock and disbelief, and the first fragile beginnings of transformation. That moment had changed the trajectory of all their lives, though in different ways for different women. 25 of the original group had chosen repatriation in the summer of 1946. They had returned to Japan carrying with them stories of American kindness that seemed impossible to believe. Yet those stories had mattered in the difficult years of occupation and reconstruction. When Japanese citizens encountered American soldiers in their devastated cities, some remembered hearing about the women who had been treated with dignity and fed beef stew, and shown that enemies could become something else. The women who returned became quiet ambassadors of the possibility of reconciliation, their experience a counterweight to bitterness and resentment. The 18 who stayed had scattered across America, each finding her own path forward. Hana had eventually opened a bakery in Seattle, combining Japanese techniques with American ingredients to create something entirely new. She had married a veteran who had served in the Pacific, a union that raised eyebrows but proved enduring. Yuki completed her nursing certification and worked at a veterans hospital, caring for men who had fought against her country with a compassion born from understanding that war created victims on all sides. Keiko had become a cultural liaison, working with the State Department to help Japanese war brides adjust to American life as thousands of them arrived in the 1950s. Her fluent English and her own experience of radical cultural transition made her invaluable. She helped women navigate everything from grocery stores to mother-in-law relationships, from cooking American food to understanding American expectations of marriage. She had never married herself, feeling that her life's work was building bridges between the two cultures that had shaped her. Private David Kim had remained in contact with several of the women over the years. He and Keiko had developed a friendship built on their shared experience of living between two worlds, of understanding what it meant to be seen as foreign by people who should have recognized them as human. He visited her restaurant regularly, and they would sit after closing discussing how the past continued to shape the present in unexpected ways. His own family had received a formal apology and modest reparations for their internment, though no amount of money could return the years they had lost.